Great. Thanks for joining us again. I appreciate you being with us. This is our Wednesday night Bible study here at Spring Creek. Obviously, we're doing a little bit different these days. We're recording all these, and we'll continue to do this even after we're able to meet back here in the building together. But we're glad you're joining us. Today we're going to talk about Daniel chapter 2. Last video, we were in chapter 1, and I told you then that Daniel's fairly simple the way it's laid out. The first 6 chapters are historical, last 6 are prophetic. Chapter 2 is kind of a blend of both. Chapter 2 involves historical kingdoms, it involves historical events, but there's also, at the end part of the chapter, a eschatological section talking about things that are yet our future. And so we'll look at that. When I look at the book of Daniel, it's very interesting to me that God has some really important principles that he wants to share with us. So let's get into Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, you've heard this, I know. You've read it, you've probably studied it. It's about a statue, a dream, a vision that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has, and Daniel has to interpret. So if you look at verses 1 through 3, it kind of begins a little bit of a prophetic section. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell his king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. The king said to them, "I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream." If you look at the way these first 3 verses set out, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Obviously, it's a very disturbing dream that he has. It troubles him. And so he calls in the magicians, all these sorcerers, soothsayers, all these folks are supposed to be able to divine the future. Ezekiel chapter 21 talks about that, Jeremiah 27:9. And this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is going to symbolize 4 Gentile world dominions, 4 Gentile kingdoms that are going to succeed one another. And then they're going to be culminated with a Messiah that's going to come. And the Messiah is going to come and establish a kingdom. So when I teach this and when I look at the book of Daniel, I interpret this from a premillennial, pre-tribulational perspective. That is that we are living in a realized kingdom of God now. I mean, God is present with us, and we can enjoy the benefits of his kingdom, but God will come and set up an earthly kingdom at a later time. And we'll talk about that as we go through Daniel. But this dream happens early in the morning, or this event happens early in the morning. Nebuchadnezzar wakes up. He's disturbed. He's upset about the dream and what went on. So he calls all these magicians in, and he tells them that he had this dream. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Look at verse 4. The Chaldeans, or those Babylonian diviners, soothsayers, they spoke to the king in Aramaic. And this is the part where it begins to change a little bit. From this point all the way through chapter 7, verse 28, the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. It's the language of the social elite, the political elite. So it switches out of Hebrew and goes into Aramaic. So in verse 4, the Chaldeans speak to the king in Aramaic, and they say, "O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we'll declare the interpretation." The king replied to the Chaldeans, "The command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you'll be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you'll receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation." They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we'll declare the interpretation." The king replied, "I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm. That if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean." Now, if you see what's going on, it's kind of a it's kind of a pathetic time. It's kind of kind of almost humorous thing. The king brings in all these magicians, and remember, they're making their living by prophesying for the king. So he's got this band of magicians and an army of diviners, and they're casting lots and looking at all their little fortune telling equipment that they have, and they're trying to predict the future. So and they're getting paid well for it. And so the king calls them in, and the king asks them to interpret the dream. And he tells them, in no uncertain terms what the deal is going to be. But look at what they say in verse 4. They say, "Tell us the dream. You tell us what you dreamed, and then we'll interpret it for you." In other words, the hard part is that we know what the dream is. The easy part is we'll tell you what it means. Anybody can make up something for what it means. Anybody can come and say, "Well, you said you had this dream. Here's an interpretation." The king said, "I want you guys to not only tell me the interpretation, but I want you to tell me what the dream was." Now, that's a little more difficult, what he dreamed. And if you read on down, obviously the king has suspected some because he said they've been lying before. So they've been making stuff up, getting kind of rich off of it. So the king calls them in and says, "Here's the deal. If you don't tell me, you're going to be torn limb from limb. You guys will be executed. Your houses burned, your houses into rubbish piles, everything destroyed. And, we'll never hear from you again. You guys will be gone." But there's a positive. Look at verse 6. Here's a positive. "But if you can do this, I got great gifts and great rewards for you." So the downside is, if you can't do it, you're dead. The upside is, if you can do it, you've got great reward. So for them, if they're sincere about this, if they really know that they can do it, there's really no debate, no question. They just do what he asks, and they get the reward. But notice what they do in verse 7. In verse 7, they answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell the dream." So they asked him a second time. They say, "Okay, we hear all this. Now, if you'll just tell us the dream." The king knows something's up. Look at verse 8. He replied, "I know for certain that you're bargaining for more time. You guys are just delaying. You guys are just trying to extend this out." He says there's no other way around it. Verses 9 and 10 makes it pretty clear that the Chaldeans, all these magicians, have tricked or fooled the king before. They agreed to lie to him, and so he knows that. He knows what's going on. So look at verse 10, because this is kind of a foolish statement. Now, these are kind of statements that you and I can't make. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who could declare this matter to the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean." Kind of a foolish thing to make, because God is going to prove that wrong and get them in a world of trouble. So that's kind of the first little section. The king has a dream. It's disturbing. It troubles him, wakes him up. He calls them in early in the morning, says, "Tell me the dream and the interpretation." They say, "You tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation." He says, "No, you guys have lied before. Tell me this or you'll be killed." All right, so now look at verse 11. Because we're going to shift gears a little bit. Verse 11, "Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there's no one else who could declare it to the king except gods, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." Now, notice that the gods here he's talking about is plural. He's talking about all the Babylonian gods, not Jehovah, not the Hebrew God, but all these other little gods. And he says, there's nobody can do this except those little gods. Verse 12, "Because of this, the king became indignant, very furious, and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, 'For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?' Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king." So if you notice what's going on, and remember, think about this. Daniel is, at this time, probably around 16 years old. You know, he's not a mature believer. He's not somebody that's been, a believer and following God and trusting God for 30, 40 years. He's a teenager. And it says in verse 11 that this was difficult. It really translates to heavy. This is a heavy thing. It's really tough. And remember, one of their jobs is to consult all these little gods. And they say that it can't be done. They're kind of boxing themselves in. And so look at verse 12. The king got mad, got furious, and ordered that the wise men be killed. Verse 13, this is a participle in the original Aramaic that indicates that the slaying should begin immediately. Look at verse 13. The decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. That indicates that this is immediate. This is going to happen right now. And so they went out and they looked for Daniel and his friends, probably Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They looked for Daniel and his buddies to actually do the killing. And so they brought them in, and look at verse 14. Daniel replied with discretion and discernment. 16 years old now. Discretion and discernment is really something like with counsel and with good taste, Daniel replied. God, and I want you to notice something as we track through Daniel's life. God always arranges for the man who can ultimately make the decision to come into Daniel's path. The guy that can actually make the call, God always arranges it so that that guy will come into Daniel's life. And that's what's about to happen. Look at verse 14. Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard. He's the captain. He's in charge. He goes and gets Daniel and his buddy, says, you got to do this execution for us. He's the guy that can make decisions. Look at verse 15. Daniel then said to Arioch, the king's commander, why is this so urgent? Why do we have to do this now? Daniel doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know about the dream, the interpretation, the command of the king to kill the wise man. He doesn't know any of that stuff. Daniel's just, minding his own business. Arioch comes in, grabs him and his buddy, says, come on, you got to do this execution. Daniel said, what's the big deal? What's the rush? I don't know what's going on. Look at verse 15. Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. Arioch told him what was wrong, what was going on. So look at verse 16 now. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time. In other words, Daniel requested an audience with the king, evidently got it. Daniel goes in, and evidently he's got an avenue to the king. He's got some ends with him. And so Daniel goes in and says to the king, can I have a little bit of time before we kill these guys, and let me try to do what you asked. Let me try to do it. Here's the thing about Daniel and being 16, and I want us to consider being, some of us, adults in our faith. Daniel had faith. Daniel believed God could do it. Daniel believed God could let him do it. Daniel trusted God. He believed God. And so he had faith, but he had a working faith. Daniel not only believed God could do this, Daniel put himself out kind of on a limb by saying, not only is God going to do this, I'm going to trust that he's going to do it with me. In other words, I have this working faith. It's not just an intellectual thing that I believe, but I actually want to work out my faith. I believe God can do that. So in verse 17, Daniel asked his friends to pray and for help. In verses 19 through 23, if you look at that's a prayer, and they're praying. Look at verse 19. The mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever. For wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. For you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. So evidently the answer didn't come right away at the prayer meeting. Daniel got the vision later in a night dream, he says. Verse 20 through 23, it involves a lot of profound truth. Actually, greater understanding from a 16-year-old than most of us adults have. And when you look at that, Daniel has a lot of insight. And it came, I think, from all of his training as a kid in the wisdom books, Proverbs. And Daniel learned all those things, and he relied on them. And so now he comes to the king. Look at verse 24. He asked for time. Now he goes back, went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows. Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I'll declare the interpretation to the king. So Daniel says, don't destroy the wise men. And here's what's interesting about that. Those wise men are going to eventually become his enemies. They are now, but they're going to eventually become even worse enemies. And Daniel is begging for their life. He says, don't kill them. He says, let me go in and let me tell the king what he needs to know. Now, watch verse 25. Kind of a funny verse, kind of a bureaucratic verse. Reminds me a lot of politicians today. Look at verse 25. Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him. Watch what he says. I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king. Well, he didn't find anybody. Daniel found him. That's a bureaucratic response. That's a politician's response. He goes to the king and says, look who I found. I've done this, trying to score some points with the king. Absolutely nothing to do with him whatsoever. So look at verse 26 now. The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? So the king said, can you do this? Probably a lot of pressure. He's 16 years old. But look what Daniel says in verse 27. Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. It's kind of a shot back at the magician. This proves Daniel's a little bit of a human, because he takes a crack at the wise men. Well, they can't do it. They can't do this thing. But look at verse 28, because verse 28 is contrary to verse 11. Verse 11, the wise men said, the gods, little g gods, all these Babylonian gods. Verse 28, Daniel says, there is a God, big G God, Hebrew God, Jehovah God, our God, in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. In other words, he's saying, what he's told you, what you dreamed about Nebuchadnezzar, is a vision from God that has to do with the future. Now, here's the thing for us. It's our past, part of it is, but it's all Nebuchadnezzar's future. Some of it is yet our future, I believe. And so Daniel says in verse 28, this was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. In other words, God didn't give this to me because I'm somebody. It's not me. I'm not taking credit for it. I'm doing it myself. He says God revealed this so that the king would know what the dream was about, so that you would know. And so now Daniel is going to say that basically your dream, Nebuchadnezzar, was a broad sweeping brushstroke through the events of history. It's not going to be specific things. It's going to be general things. It's going to take place over a lot of years of history. And so now if you look at verse 31, we're going to start. Because what he's going to do first, Daniel's going to tell the dream, and then he'll interpret the dream. And we'll get into more of this kind of thing because chapter 8 is almost a parallel chapter. It talks about the same kinds of things. But we'll discuss it more as we go through Daniel. But look at verse 31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. Now, remember, this is what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. And he said, I don't want just the interpretation. I want my actual dream. He says, you were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is his dream. Now, look at verse 31. He says this was awesome. Awesome, the word awesome actually comes from a word that means to fear. It's like the same word in chapter 1. He was troubled. He was fearful of it. In other words, he said, King, you had a nightmare. Not only was it a dream, it was a nightmare. And so then he goes to tell him the dream in verse 32. In verse 32, he tells him that in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue, and the statue was of a person, and the statue was made of 4 metals, and the metals were of descending value. In other words, it started with a head of gold, a chest of silver, thighs of bronze, and then feet of iron and a mixture of clay. Verse 34, he says, as you're watching this statue, as you're looking at it, there's a stone that's not cut with hands, that kind of almost like it comes out of a mountain, and it hits the statue on the feet and crushes the statue. And he says the whole statue then was crumbled, and then it just began to blow away. Look at verse 35. Look at what he says. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain, and it filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Look at verse 36. This is a confident statement from a 16-year-old. Look at what he says. This was the dream. He didn't say, did I get it right? Was I right? Am I okay? He said, this was your dream. And then he says, now I'll tell you how to interpret it. I've told you the dream. That's it. Now I will interpret it for you. In verses 37 through 45 is the interpretation. And I'll let you read these for yourself, these verses. But here's what he says. In verse 37, he identifies Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold. He says, you're the head of gold. And then the other metals will be kingdoms that follow yours. So in other words, you're at the top. You're the head of gold. You're the prized kingdom, the great kingdom. And then there are going to be somewhat lesser kingdoms to follow you. Nebuchadnezzar in verse 38, wherever the sons of men dwell, or the breath of the field, or the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold. It says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. This is around 605 BC. In verse 39, the kingdoms changed. After you, he says, the gold's the head, but then there's a chest of silver. There's a silver kingdom. He says, after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you. Then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the earth. Verse 40, then there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it'll be a divided kingdom. All right, here's what he's talking about. He says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. Silver is usually agreed to be the Medo-Persian Empire. As a matter of fact, if you look at, and when we get there, we'll look at Daniel chapter 8, verse 3. He describes the Medo-Persians as a ram. So the silver part of the statue, the silver kingdom, is a ram in Daniel 8. Verse 3, that's the second kingdom. They rule, they're going to take over and rule between 539 and 333 BC. So Nebuchadnezzar takes over first. He's the gold head. And then the Medo-Persians are the next. Bronze is the third. They're the bronze, or Greece is the third kingdom. They're the bronze kingdom. They started their rule in 333 BC. The last kingdom, the Iron Kingdom, is Rome. And then he gives us a new piece of information. Look at verse 41. Not only are there feet, but there's toes. This is new information. Divided, he says this is a divided kingdom. Divided in Hebrew means a composite. In other words, it means it's made up of different things. Kind of like the European Union. This is the Roman Empire. Verse 42, he says, part of this kingdom will be strong, and part of it will be brittle. It's a divided kingdom. It's made up of different parts. In verse 43, he says there'll be a mixture. There'll be a combined empire. That's kind of like the European Union, the Roman Empire, together. And so for us, these kingdoms are all past. For Daniel, they're future. But I want you to see something about this. Look at verse 43 and verse 44. In that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men. But they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. They're divided, not going to be totally unified. Verse 44, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. That's yet our future. That's the eschaton. That's our future. Zechariah 14, Jesus will come back on the Mount of Olives and establish a kingdom. So here's when you read Daniel, we're going to break this down. We're going to get into this idea of 70 weeks and all this a little bit later. But if you want to just look at Daniel chapter 2, here's something to note. Between verse 43 and verse 44, there is a gap. The Old Testament prophets didn't see the gap. What's the gap? It's us. It's the church age. We are living in the gap between Daniel 2:43 and Daniel 2:44. It's a gap that we're currently living in. And then when you talk about verses 44 and 45, he's talking about the kingdom that Jesus will set up when he comes and establishes his kingdom in the millennium. We're in the gap. So we're living in that gap. And if you follow a pre-tribulational, premillennial perspective on this, the rapture of the church will take place, followed by the 7-year tribulation, then a 1,000-year reign of Christ, or the 7-year tribulation followed by the parousia, or the second coming of Jesus, and then the 1,000-year reign of Christ. We can look at all this in Ezekiel 37, 21 through 28, Revelation 20, verses 2, 4, 6, and 7, Acts chapter 1, verse 6. There's plenty of ideas about this in Scripture that we're going to look at as we pursue the book of Daniel. Now look at verse 45. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Daniel is very overcome. He can't believe it. These things are true. He says, you know this is all true. And look at verse 47. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods. In other words, the supreme, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal the mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts. And he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief priest over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made requests of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. So he remembered his friends, and he got them brought up. Habakkuk really records for us the same thing. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 6, he talks about raising up the Chaldeans. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, which is a verse that started the Reformation, he says the righteous, the just will live by faith. So Daniel is exhibiting great faith, and the king rewards him, but it's ultimately God who has blessed him and put him in this position to interpret this dream. So Daniel has now given King Nebuchadnezzar a dream of what is going to be Nebuchadnezzar's future, succeeding kingdoms in lesser importance, in lesser strength, and then a vision of, I believe, what's yet our future. The eschaton, the reign of Christ. And we'll get into this as we go through Daniel. I'll give you more instances of this, more verses on this. But that's Daniel chapter 2. Thanks for joining us in this video. Next Wednesday, we'll go over Daniel chapter 3. And I'll continue to post these online. And again, we can have an online Bible study if you want to comment, question, whatever. You can do that on Facebook. And we're glad you're tuning in. Everybody stay safe, be smart. I know that God is ultimately in control, but God has given us some common sense to protect ourselves. And if we have to socially distance ourselves for a little bit, so be it. Just do what the doctors and the government advises. God told us to be in submission to our governments and follow them as long as they're not asking us to do anything unbiblical. So we can do that. We'll still have our services online, and you can still worship. Nobody's asking us to get rid of our worship services. We're just going to do them online temporarily. Thanks for understanding, and please join us next Wednesday, and we'll go over Daniel chapter 3. Thank you so much.